Hello, I am doing another video for winterinbaseball.com, my blog about baseball and all things baseball. So this is another video doing my baseball biography. If you're into these sort of commentaries, liking and subscribing would be awesome. So definitely would appreciate if you did that. I do plan on doing a few more commentaries if um, I don't know if the subject matter comes up that I find interesting to talk about and ramble about. And then once the season starts, I might actually go into the more game by game sort of commentary, but it might be more Cubs centric. It might be baseball centric for the season. I'm not really sure. It depends on what I have time to do and how everything kind of works out. Um, Kind of going into this, we've kind of gone through the first, I would say, 9 years of my life that I've experienced when it comes to baseball. And here is my cat again. She can't get enough of me talking about baseball. But which basically covered the 1986 to 1994 seasons up through the strike. I'm going to kind of go through, I would say, the 1995 through 1997 seasons, which goes up to the 1998 season, which I've already kind of covered a little bit in my video on my commentary about Sammy Sosa. So if you wanted to cover the 1998 season, I would probably just watch that. I'm probably going to skip, not get too in depth into that season, and then once I'm beyond that to like 1999, 2000, start to get into my teenage years associated with baseball. That's probably my plan going forward with this. As for right now, I'm going to talk about the 1995 season. The 1995 season was a little bit weird because it was following the strike season. And so there was a lot of people who were very, very disgruntled when it came to watching baseball and following the majors because people were really upset about the strike. People were just saw everything as greedy. This is something that they saw as taken from them. And so the 1995 season, which also started late, had kind of a weird vibe to begin with. A lot of us were kind of just angry at the sport, so a lot of people just didn't watch. A lot of people weren't paying attention. The attendance was down. The fans were down. You could just tell kind of the way people were taken to the sport was definitely not great. I know my dad personally was not into baseball for a little bit, and so because of that, I started to follow by. I was getting to be 8, 9 years old in my personal life, so I was spending a lot more time outside. I was spending a lot more time with friends, probably paying attention to other sports as well. I know the NFL I started to get more and more into as a kid, and so just the 1995 season just had a bizarre feel to it. So I don't really remember much about the season itself. I do kind of remember picking up as the playoffs started going, and the series between the Mariners and the Yankees does stand out pretty strongly. My dad did watch that series. I remember watching at least a couple games of that series with him later in the series. I remember seeing the Edgar Martinez hitting a grand slam in game four of that series, I believe, to kind of put the series away. It looked like the Yankees had a chance to win and move on. And then game five, the the famous double down the left field line, which the Mariners scored and won. They ended up going to the American League Championship Series and eliminated the Yankees in 1995. It was Don Mattingly's actually last season, so I think there was part of it was like hoping to see if he could get to win a World Series as a Yankee, who's pretty much the one big time Yankee player who never won a World Series. So that is kind of I don't I want to go so far as saying like a sad story, but like probably the best Yankee to not win a World Series was Don Mattingly. Although maybe there was something back in like the 1901 like early area pre-Ruth. Maybe there's some other players in there that you can make that argument for. I'm not really sure. I just remember wanting the Yankees to win, and they ended up not winning. But it might have been better that Seattle won. The Yankees ended up building a dynasty after that fact, anyways. Although Don Mattingly was not on the team in 1996, the following year when they did win the World Series. But 1995 as a whole, that's pretty much all I remember as far as that season was that series. I didn't watch the World Series between Cleveland and Atlanta. Um, have no memories of that series whatsoever, except for watching the highlights and watching the Braves, who finally actually won the World Series after so many years of getting there and not winning, or having great seasons and not getting to the World Series. And that was kind of a big deal. I remember Bob Costas' call saying something along the lines of the team of the 90s finally has their world championship, but that's more from watching highlights of different celebrations and World Series endings as opposed to remembering it in the moment, which I didn't really do. I was probably a lot more into other baseball related things. First of all, playing baseball. I know, and I don't remember the exact years of this, and maybe it even falls before the 1995 threshold. So sorry if I am out of timeline here, but my personal life, I remember playing a lot of baseball. I was on the literally all-star team in like second or third grade for pitching. I didn't really throw hard. I mostly just threw strikes. And when you're a second grader, a lot of second graders don't try to hit the ball. So I just struck out a lot of people by throwing the ball right down the middle of the plate. And that got me good enough to get to my Little League All-Star or All-Star team that year. I guess it wasn't even Little League, it was Mustang League. And hey, that's probably the peak of my athletic performance was being an all-star in second or third grade, whatever year it was, for Temple Sporting Goods out of Bettendorf, Iowa. So shout out to them, I guess, if they still exist. But I represented you well. I was an elite Mustang League player, and yeah, that happened. Remember doing that a lot. I remember playing in my backyard a lot, the wiffle ball, but not just like it wasn't even just baseball. It was other sports. It was I played a lot of basketball in my driveway, football in the front yard, things like that. Um, I also started to get more into video games. Now, granted, this is probably more a little bit later, 1996, 1997, but I started to get more into like baseball video games. I had this weird Microsoft DOS game that there's no way I'll ever find out what the name of this game was. It was very, very text heavy, although I think there was a design of a baseball field and it was definitely like with that DOS black background, you had to get into it by doing one of the DOS keys. It was like I don't even remember what keyword it was, probably baseball or something like that. And it was very very text heavy. It wasn't even like you didn't even select. I think we selected American League or National League. I could even be wrong on that. And then there were major league players involved because I remember like Wade Boggs, Ryan Sandberg on the in the game, and I played this game a lot. And it was basically just managing. You basically just hit swing away, and the game did everything for you. There wasn't even much user input, but I played the game pretty obsessively, and I would keep track of the scores and the stats on a piece of paper as different things played out. I don't even remember what I would have been sorting because, like I said, the game wasn't really that in depth. It was basically just managing to some extent because you could choose to bunt, you could choose to steal, you could choose to do things like that. And I remember playing that a lot. It was really the only access I had to video games because I didn't have consoles growing up. It was just anything I could get on my computer, I would play. And there weren't a lot of baseball games that I was paying for on my computer until later on when I got AAA baseball or triple play baseball. I'm sorry, AAA baseball is a minor league. Triple play baseball for EA Sports, which is the precursor to MVP baseball, which ended up being some say with the best. Well, MVP 2005 is some say is the best baseball video game of all time. But I played Triple Play baseball before that, so I remember playing a lot of Triple Play 97, Triple Play 98, and I really did enjoy playing those. I do remember playing as different teams, especially in the Triple Play 97. I remember playing as the New York Yankees a lot. It was actually the year following their World Series win in 1996. And then Triple Play 98, I played as the Arizona Diamondbacks, and I remember very specifically going undefeated with the Arizona Diamondbacks because I put Kerry Wood on the Diamondbacks. And this is before they won the World Series in '01. And I'm not even sure they were good yet in '99. I just picked them as the expansion team because I thought it'd be fun to carrying them a certain way. I do also think I created myself and probably hit 120 home runs at one point. Something crazy. That's just the things that I would do back then in those games. But I remember playing those baseball games quite a bit. Um, that was mostly my how I interacted with baseball. Early on, when I played a lot of wiffle ball in my yard, I would do this kind of weird thing where I go through because I have a lot of baseball cards. It's a collection that I have, my dad had, so we kind of combined them into one. But at the time, it was mostly just my cards, and I would basically pull the cards out one by one, and I would play like some weird round robin sort of tournament that didn't really make any sense and would have taken way too long to complete. But I would have the teams play each other in my backyard with me taking the role of one of the teams. I had different ways that I would do this. I would go on the mound and I would basically pitch, and we had a gas meter. And I'm sure my parents loved me throwing a wiffle ball up against the siding of their house. But I had a gas meter and also destroying the grass, which I definitely was told not to do. And I know at one point they resodded, but I just kind of kept going out there anyways. But they had like a gas meter and it was circular, and it had like pipes and stuff sticking off of it. And what worked perfectly for that, or the reason why that worked perfectly, is it was centered perfectly behind the home plate. I actually had a plastic home plate that I got in some toy set years ago that I would use as home plate, so that was kind of nice and perfect for that. And the gas meter was actually perfectly centered where a strike zone was. It looked like a catcher's mitt. So I would pitch against that, and I had different meanings. So like if I threw the ball and it nailed the gas meter perfectly, that was a pitch right down the middle. The opposing player crushed it. And so I was hit like the goal was basically to hit different parts of the meter or throw it over the strike zone without hitting the meter, and that would be considered a strike. If not, it was a ball, and I would just determine the hits based off where it hit on the meter. And it was very I had to use my imagination. Obviously, nobody was actually hitting the baseball, but that's what I would do. And I think that's ultimately kind of how I learned how to pitch. But granted, I wasn't a great pitcher, so it's acting like this is like a great story, but it's not like I went on to be any sort of a great pitcher. I don't think I pitched beyond. I pitched a little bit in middle school when I played, but I never pitched in high school or beyond or anything like that. But I do think it helped me learn how to throw strikes and be a little bit better at that, I guess. So that was kind of cool. Um, but that's what I would do in my backyard, baseball related. That's how I would kind of basically simulate baseball in my yard. That was my baseball video games, is going out into my backyard and pretending to be playing wiffle ball, I suppose. I also would bat. I would basically toss the ball in the air, hit it, and there was a big tree in my yard, so if the ball got stuck in the tree or if it hit the tree, that was usually a fly out. And if I could hit it around it, hit it over the fence, home run. Like there's different things that I would do to kind of simulate the game, and I had my own vision for how it worked. We also had across the way a very old angry couple who's if the ball went into their fence, you're pretty much done. The ball's gone. They would yell at me if I tried to go get the ball. They didn't like me climbing on their fence. They would somehow, if they had a sixth sense, they always knew that you were by their fence, and they would come out back and they would yell at you and be mean. And so once the ball went over the fence, didn't really mess with it. They'd always told me if I went around, which I would have had to go all the way around the block and knock on their front door, they would have gotten the ball for me, which I guess is fair, but also I didn't want to go all the way around the block to talk to mean old people. That just wasn't something that I wanted to do. But then it found out later on in my life, I ended up, not even that later on, it was while I played baseball, we had to sell candy bars to help raise money for the league. So I went over there to sell them candy bars and try to make peace because I knew it was their house. I remember going there specifically, like, well, I'm sorry that I've bothered you by knocking the ball over the fence and all this stuff. Here's some candy bars. Can you help me play baseball? That sort of thing. Turns out the man was diabetic. So I didn't really make very good peace there, trying to sell the diabetic man candy bars. And then I ended up getting a lecture about how, oh, well, you can just come around and knock, and we would have gotten the baseball for you. So just not a very good relationship with these people. I'm sure they've long since passed. Now I feel bad. But, you know, it is what it is, I guess. That's the nature of having neighbors, I suppose. Um, but yeah, it was always a very, very heartbreaking. It was really interesting because, like, in order to get the ball over the fence, I had to hit one perfectly. It would literally have to go exact line drive under this big tree we had in the backyard, and then carry straight forward. It basically had to be a line drive with a wiffle ball under the tree that was far enough to clear the fence. So when you did it, it was a pretty impressive feat of power, but it was the most depressing thing in the world because you knew you lost your baseball. And I certainly wasn't going to climb the fence and try to get it. I didn't even like climbing fences anyways. That wasn't even something I was able to do that well. And you're going to add the caveat of some old people yelling at you. It just wasn't good. It wasn't something I wanted to deal with. So that's that was that. It's ultimately a big reason why I stopped even playing wiffle ball in the backyard there because I didn't want to deal with that situation. Ended up playing more and more basketball in my driveway where there was much less risk of the ball going to the neighbor's house. And if it did go to the next door neighbor's house on that side of the house, much nicer people, wouldn't get yelled at over that. It was a much different experience. So um, that's why I started to switch to playing a lot more basketball at home. Just a lot easier in that circumstance. But that basically 1995, like I said, not a lot of memories as far as watching games. I'm sure there's games. It's even possible I went to games that year, although I don't really know for sure. Um, Probably did a lot more minor leagues. Probably did something along those lines. Yeah, 1995, as far as me as a baseball fan, is an absolute blur. I know, like, I'm still trying to find my favorite team, so I'm probably loosely followed the Yankees and the Marlins and all that stuff. I do also remember maybe loosely liking the Pirates or one of those other teams that I also liked at one point due to my association with T-ball and going to games in the past and things like that. But 1995, I don't remember much of. 1996 is kind of a similar thing. I think I started to get more into the season as a whole in 96. I'm about 10 years old, so like there's more and more connection to things. I think I got more into the season, especially towards the end when the playoffs started, because I very, very much remember watching the 1996 New York Yankees play against the Texas Rangers. And I think this is the first time I had a TV in my room. My dad had an old tube TV that we put in my room because they had nowhere else to put it. It didn't have cable, it was connected to an antenna. But with that, anytime like sports came on, which it would have been like on your local like Fox or like a national Fox broadcast or CBS broadcast, whenever there's a major sporting event, I do remember. I think this was the time that happened because I remember very much sitting either in my room or maybe it was an upstairs. I don't remember exactly the location of the TV, but somehow there was a TV that I had access to that felt more like my own TV than the one in the basement that the family used. And so with that, I remember very no, I think it was in our living room. It was in our living room upstairs, which was separate than the family room from downstairs. So in the living room upstairs, which felt more like a larger room for me and my sister in the house, because I remember watching the 1996 Olympics on this TV, and I watched a lot of the Olympics that year. And so when the baseball playoffs came along, the 1996 playoffs, I remember very, very distinctly watching the Yankees and Rangers, and then in the ALCS, I believe the Orioles and the Yankees. Although I didn't, this is the year of the Jeffrey Mayer game. Never saw that live, though I do remember different, like, it was a big deal. It was a big deal that Jeffrey Mayer, if you don't know what that is, he was a kid who put his arm over the fence and robbed a, stole a home run for the Yankees. Would have been an out. The Orioles player was camped under it. Jeffrey Mayer puts his glove out, catches the ball. Should have been fan interference. Wasn't called fan interference. The Orioles got really, really angry, probably justified, and the Yankees went on to win the series, which put them in the World Series. I remember very distinctly a ESPN Sports Center montage. It was basically a what if that call was called correctly. It was a whole montage that went through. Well, now this is the Orioles win the World Series and all that stuff. Excuse me. I remember thinking in 1985 that this was the greatest piece of sports editing I'd ever seen. Like, how did they do that? How did they make it look realistic? And I've looked for that montage before, but I've never found it. So I would like to see that montage again. I think it would be a very fun montage to see. It probably wasn't as captivating as I remember it, but I do remember that Sports Center montage of that. And I, honestly, it's weird because I remember the 1995 ALC. I don't remember the AL 95 ALCS as much as I remember or the 1986 ALCS as much as I remember the 95 World Series, or I'm sorry, as the 1996 ALDS. There we go. Words are coming out. I also do remember very, very vividly watching the World Series in 1996. And this is the first World Series that I feel like I was into. It's honestly the first World Series that I remember sitting down to watch. This was the Braves and the Yankees, and the Yankees were heavy underdogs in this series. The Atlanta Braves were the 90s Braves. They were defending champions. They won in 1995. They finally got their World Series. They seemed to be past their curse or playoff choking or whatever it was that they had. Most likely it was just baseball is random and these are short series and anything can happen. But at the time, I don't think it was viewed that way. It was viewed the Braves just can't get the job done when it matters. But then they finally did, and the 1996 series was now the Yankees, who haven't been to the World Series, I want to say, since '81. Was probably the last time they went. So that's 15 years, a decent chunk of time. I mean, that's what they were this year when they played the Dodgers. They hadn't been in the World Series since 2009. So similar position, also heavy underdogs in that series. Maybe not heavy, but like pretty definitely underdogs in that series, although they ended up losing. 1996 probably had a similar feel to it, where the Yankees were, a playoff team. The early 90s, they were kind of up and coming a little bit after struggling so much in the early 90s. He had kind of this core group of players, with like, Mario Rivera was like a setup man at the time, not a closer. Bernie Williams, uh, I'm sure like other players, Derek Jeter was more early in his career. People like that were coming up with the Yankees, and then the Braves were just the Braves. I mean, they had Smoltz, Glavine, Maddox, the big time pitching staff. They had the other players that you associate with the Braves. But this series, I remember very, very vividly watching the first two games, and Andrew Jones, I think he was 19 at the time, and I think he's still the youngest player of the home run in the World Series, though maybe it's possible Soto passed him when he was with the Nationals. I don't know for sure. But I remember this kid, Andrew Jones, and I remember like all these other players from the Braves that you knew, they weren't the ones who got the job done. It was Andrew Jones who hit a big home run. I think it was two home runs in the first game of the series. I'm sure that can be corrected. But I remember thinking like this kid out of nowhere is the one beating the Yankees out of everyone on the Braves. Now, granted, I believe Andy Pettitte pitched the first game, and I remember thinking Andy Pettitte's terrible. Like why are people talking about how great this guy is? Like he's terrible. He got absolutely rocked in the first game. Well, he did, but stuff happens. Obviously, looking back, like who knows? Like baseball is not a one game sport. Like you can have a bad game, it happens, and it just so happens with Andy Pettitte, it was on the World Series. So the first time I really watched Andy Pettitte pitch, I thought this guy was a nobody and not very good. Obviously I was wrong, but games ones and two, it just looked like the Braves were absolutely going to slaughter the Yankees and win the World Series easily. And then the series went to Atlanta. And once it went to Atlanta, I kind of started to tune out a little bit because it was like, well, it just wasn't going to happen. Like the Braves were going to win the World Series, not the Yankees. And then the Yankees had their 6-run comeback, and I believe I honestly don't offhand remember the game. I think it was game 4 or 5 because the Yankees ended up winning in 6. So it had to have been the Yankees basically went to Atlanta and won all 3 games. I just don't remember which game the big 6-run comeback was. I could easily look it up right now, but either way, the game that the game that it happened doesn't necessarily matter for what I'm doing here. I did not watch the game live. It was on. It was probably on late. It was during a school night, so I didn't actually wouldn't have been able to stay up to watch it. But I remember hearing about it the next morning, and my dad had taped it on VHS, and so I do remember what happened the next morning, hearing that the Yankees were down 6-0, and they came back and won. And of course, the first thing I wanted to do was watch that. So I think even before school, I believe I got up. I don't think I watched the entire game, but I put the thing on just to see that inning where the Yankees came back, and I watched it full force. I watched. It was Jim Leyritz hit the 3 home run, or was it Jim Leyritz? I don't know why I'm like the names aren't completely clear to me. I think it was Leyritz who hit the 3-run homer to tie it. But either way, I watched that play before school. It was pretty much the same thing as what you would do today. If that happened today, the clip will be all over YouTube and X and whatever social media site, and you could just easily go there, and I would probably watch the highlights before I get in the shower and be like, oh, that was really cool that that happened. But back then, there wasn't accessibility with that sort of thing. If I wanted to watch those highlights, I would have had to have watched SportsCenter, and at the exact time, and I would have to know the exact time they're going to play those highlights, which they wouldn't show because they want you to watch the highlights due to advertising stuff. It probably would have been the first segment, so it probably would have been easy to figure out. But if you didn't wake up during the first segment, or if you didn't turn it on during the first segment, you weren't going to be able to see the highlights because the rest of the show is going to play out and they'll talk about the rest of the stuff. So to see those highlights, you have to know the exact time when to watch. Or through something like this where we had taped the World Series, you had to go to the exact spot on the tape and watch the highlights that way. So it was much more of a process, but I remember very distinctly watching that 3-run homer to tie the game before school because I wanted to see it. I wanted to see what happened. I wanted to see how it happened, how it played out. How did the Yankees come back from 6-0 to win this game? And so with that comeback, I was now reinvested in the series and I was really really excited. Now, like I said before, I was basically claiming myself to be a Yankees fan in 1996. Um, Now looking back, I won't say like, oh, this is a World Series that I got to enjoy as a fan of a team because I didn't watch the entire season. I would just ultimately say I bandwagon jumped the Yankees that year. But it's kind of true, kind of not true. Like I said, I grew up kind of claiming the Yankees to be my favorite team because of my dad. So there was some extent where I was rooting for them as my team. And I remember being very into game 6. They ultimately won the game, won the World Series. I was excited. And I did this really weird thing where I decided to draw signs and for poorly hand draw the Yankees logo and write like world champions on the signs and go outside to my front yard and I would hold these signs up to cars driving by um, to celebrate the Yankees winning the World Series. I lived in Iowa. Nobody really cared. And it was kind of a weird thing that I did. And I drew them with pen. So chances are, if you were driving by, you probably just saw some kid holding up a sign. You probably thought I was trying to sell lemonade in October. Be my best guess. And you're probably just confused when you didn't see a lemonade stand. So if you ever remember, if you were in Bettendorf, Iowa, driving your car down the street in Greenbrier, and you saw some weird kid just holding up signs, and I taped him to a ruler, so it kind of looked like I was picketing. Maybe I was going on strike against my parents. I don't know, but that's what I was doing. I was holding up signs celebrating the Yankees, and you should feel bad because you didn't honk or say anything. And that's mean. You made a 10-year-old sad. So I just want you to know that that happened. But that's what I did after the Yankees won the World Series in 1996. The following year in 1997, again, I'm still going through this journey to find my favorite baseball team and figure out what team that I really, really am going to be invested with for the rest of my life. I don't know. I guess it was a weird dating, baseball dating journey. I don't know what you want to call it, but the 1997 season, because again, the problem was I could never get too invested with the Yankees because they weren't on TV constantly, and so the only way I could actually follow the team would have been through Sports Center highlights and box scores the next morning. So once the off season happens and you're mentally checked out, like mentally not in tune with baseball, because it's not like it is today where you can follow the hot stove every single day online and um, you know, just live the sport if you really want to. You kind of just mentally aren't there because if the paper isn't covering it or if Spence Sports Center wasn't covering it, it's out of sight, out of mind. You don't think about it too much. The only time you ever would really think about it is if a big deal happened or things like that in the off season. So kind of just didn't even think about the baseball season anymore the rest of the year. 1997 rolls around. The Cubs, I kind of still, again, I've always still kind of passively followed the Cubs too because they're the easiest team to watch. And locally, a lot of people like the Cubs, so there was talk about the Cubs, but you also kind of knew that they're the bad team. They're the Cubs, they're a joke, they're not anybody that you take that seriously. And in 1997, they get off to a terrible start. I believe, I don't know the exact losing streak to start the year. I want to say maybe it was like 12 games, something like that. I know it was a pretty ridiculously terrible start to the year where they start 0-12 to the point where in my gym class we would do trivia questions in the morning and I was still in elementary school so we would do like trivia questions in the morning. Our gym teacher would ask uh, just basically trivia questions about the night before, like what happened in sports before. And one of the questions was the Cubs, did they win their like who did they beat in their last game to end their losing streak? And I didn't actually know the answer because I wasn't really following the Cubs that closely, but I do remember that's basically how I learned that they ended their terrible win, like terrible losing streak to start the year was this trivia question in class. And to this day, I actually don't remember the answer. Whatever, the 1997 Cubs were not a fun experience, I'm sure. I can't say I went through it too deeply because, like I've said before, I didn't start becoming a hardcore Cubs fan until the next year. So it was mostly just like I was disappointed that it was happening. I want the Cubs to be good. Like I even then I wanted the Cubs to be good. I always thought it would be a great story. But once they weren't, it was kind of like, oh well, I mean they're the Cubs. That's just what they do. They lose, and it's not that big of a deal. And I also think that might have been Ryan Sandberg's last year too. Now that I think about it, And that's another interesting thing because he was one of my first, probably one of my first favorite Cubs players at the very least, Ryan Sandberg, just because it was a name that I always came across. And I've told the story about. Actually, I don't remember if I told the story about this on here. So I'll tie it back to my early days when I talked about the Mickey Mouses. So I've told this in the previous thing that I used to play wiffle ball in my yard as a member of the Mickey Mouses. One of the teams that we used to play that I would create, and obviously this is all imaginative because this team doesn't exist. Surprise, surprise. I would play the Ryan, or I would play. I think I called them the Ryan Sandburs, but at the very least it was the Sandburs. And now, listen, I'm saying the word Sandbur, which is basically like a little prickly seed that gets on your sock a lot, like grandparents' house on a farm. My grandparents used to live on a farm in Iowa, and I would get these things on my sock all the time if you walk in the wrong places, and they're a pain to get out. Like they don't feel very comfortable. They're just little prickly seeds, sandburrs. You can look them up if you'd like, and you'll see exactly what I mean. So I thought Ryan Sandberg, I thought his name was Ryan Sandburr, and so because of that, I named this baseball team because I associated, hey, Ryan Sandburr with baseball. And so the team we would always play is the Sandburrs. And because Sandburrs are annoying, they were like the ultimate bad guy team, like you would see in a Disney movie, where you always have the bad guy team, or I guess any sports movie, you always have the angry bad guy team with like angry characters and stuff. Which I always thought was weird because in those movies, the fans of those teams, they're not like, oh, this we're the bad guy team. Like they just want their team to win, and they're probably getting annoyed that they're losing to like the team of misfits. Um, so it'd be kind of interesting to see a movie from the perspective of the bad guy team. But anyways, that was the team we would always play. It was the Sandburrs when I was the Mickey Mouses. So if I ever take it off big, maybe somebody in like MLB The Show or Out of the Park Baseball or any game with a creative option can create the Sandburrs and the Mickey Mouses because that would be kind of fun to replay that the games that I used to play when I was 2 or 3 or whatever year it was. But anyways, that's my aside. Ryan Sandberg, one of the first players that I knew, aside from Don Mattingly. Other people like Ricky Henderson, Jose Canseco are other players that I was familiar with at a very, very young age. Um, but Ryan Sandberg, I believe, retired in 1997. But the rest of the regular season, I don't have a lot of connection to because, like I said, the only teams that I could watch were the Cubs and the Braves on a day-to-day basis. The Cubs were bad, and it was hard to get invested to a team that was bad and seen as a joke. The Braves, you kind of knew they were going to win all the time in the regular season, and I personally like underdogs more than power teams. It's just always how he's been. So I like the teams who kind of come out of nowhere or at the very least struggle to win. I think that's why I ultimately became a Cubs fan. But the Braves in the regular season weren't very exciting to me because you knew what was going to happen. They're going to win. They're going to win a bunch of games, win the division by a lot of games, and get to the playoffs. If there's ever going to be investment in the Braves, it would have been in the playoffs. But the thing is, everybody's accessible in the playoffs. Once the playoffs are on, they're always on TV. So the Braves wouldn't have been special to me at that point. So never could get too into the Braves. I did like to tune, and plus they are always on at like weird times during the night. They're always on like 6:40 Central Time, or yeah, in Central Time it was always like 6:40. They were starting or something like that, or maybe it was 7:40. But they're always starting at nighttime, and TBS had weird start times back then. It was always like they started all their shows at like '07, I think. So maybe it was like 7:07 is when these games started. So that was just always weird and confusing. And I don't know why they did that. It was some sort of marketing reason. But the Braves were always on at night, and I was doing stuff at night, whether it be playing baseball or I just had other things I wanted to be doing at nighttime, maybe hanging out in my room, reading, or whatever it was that I did. So I just never really took the time to watch the Braves as the other accessible team. The Chicago White Sox were on the Sports Channel, and they were my other local team, and they're on the Sports Channel, which was like an extra cable channel that you had to pay extra for, which we just never did. So I never really watched White Sox games either, because they just weren't as accessible. And then the other, I want to say the other two, like other local teams that people associate with Iowa, which is funny because these teams are blacked out on MLB Network. be like the Brewers, the Cardinals, the Royals, and I think the Twins. There's a lot of teams blocked out in the Midwest, which makes absolutely no sense. There's a lot of teams blocked out, at least in Iowa, which makes no sense. We don't have any major league sports teams, so I don't understand why all these teams are blocked out. But that's an issue for another day. But none of those teams could be watched routinely. I know that I think there were certain channels that I could access at my grandparents' house on antenna. Every once in a while, on like a Saturday, you could catch a Brewers broadcast. I remember that the Cardinals would play once a week on a local channel where I lived, but none of these teams were like daily accessible. And so, yes, there were kids. I don't know anybody who grew up a Brewers fan. I don't know anyone. I really don't know that many Brewers fans, period, in my life. I've know of people that I know through Wisconsin who are from Wisconsin who are Brewers fans, but like that's a little different. Like you grew up with that team, that makes more sense. But like growing up where I grew up, I never met a Brewers fan, even though the Brewers are right next to Chicago. I knew a lot of White Sox fans, I knew a lot of Cardinals fans, and I knew one or two Twins fans. Didn't know any Royals fans either, so that's kind of interesting as well. Like it's kind of interesting like to see the geographical breakdown of fandoms. The Cardinals, I always thought was a little. I mean, it was clearly because the team was a successful franchise, and I think a lot of it was their parents like the Cardinals, so they like the Cardinals, so it was kind of passed down. But I don't really understand the other stuff. The White Sox probably was a similar thing too. Plus, the White Sox in the early '90s were kind of cool, like with like Frank Thomas and Robin Ventura. Bo Jackson played for them. Um, just other figures. I think the White Sox for the time period were actually viewed as a pretty cool team to follow, kind of similar to the Mariners of the time. But you just had a lot of marketable players, King Griffey Jr. That sort of thing. So I think people just got into that sort of aspect of it. I'm sure a lot of other White Sox fans who are local. I'm sure their parents probably their parents like the White Sox or something along those lines too. But for the most part, where I grew up, I think a lot of Cubs fans because they were very very accessible. Even though they were never successful, they were very very accessible. Um, but yeah, 1997 never really got too into the regular season because of that. Like the only teams that were accessible were the Atlanta Braves, who were on at night that I wasn't watching, and they were really really good, probably too good for me to care, and the Cubs, who were terrible. Um, so not much regular season. The other team I latched onto, and I've said this before, was the Florida Marlins, and it was because of their teal colored hats, and I viewed them as like really interesting. They felt I don't know, they felt like something that I liked. They had that underdog feel because they were an expansion team. Even though in 1997 they actually spent a lot of money on star players, Bobby Womania, Gary Sheffield. They had a very good pitching set. They were a really very good team. There's obviously a reason why they went to the playoffs and won the World Series, but I picked up on them in the 1997 season when they made their first playoff berth because here's this new expansion team. I remember watching them beat the Dodgers, and I've always kind of liked them in passing because of their unique colors, because of their newness, because I don't know, there was just someone that I liked. I liked the Florida Marlins at a young age, and 1997 they're in the playoffs playing the Atlanta Braves. So there's that underdog story of the Marlins, who again weren't really underdogs, but they were because they did win the wild card. They weren't considered as good as the Atlanta Braves, who are the established power, who are going for their third straight pennant and going for the second World Series in 3 years. And they're playing the upstart Marlins. Now, granted, now at this point the wild card was in existence, and there was like rounds before that. But I got into the Marlins playoff run in the NLCS when they played the Braves. And I remember doing what I could to watch that series. I remember watching them play in my friend's basement. We watched the Marlins and Braves and got really into the Florida Marlins. I remember going to the bowling alley with the same friend and watching at the bowling alley. They had a TV on top of one of the vending machines, and I would run over to the vending machine between frames to watch the Florida Marlins play because I was really really invested into this World Series run. They ended up winning that series and going to the World Series where they played the Cleveland Indians. And I don't believe this was considered a very popular World Series, even though it was a very, very good World Series. I know there was one wild game. I don't know the final score, but I think both teams scored double digit runs. The game went 7 series or 7 games, and there was never a point where it felt like one team was going to win over the other. And it goes to the final seventh games of the series, and I remember being so amped up to watch Game 7 of that World Series, and it was the first time I'd ever watched a Game 7 of the World Series. Like I said, this is the second World Series I've ever followed in its entirety. So I was very, very excited to see what would happen. I was very nervous because I really, really wanted the Marlins to win, but I also knew like anything can happen in this game, and I watched the entirety of the game. The Cleveland Indians led most of the time, most of the game, and I was disappointed. But I was like, hey, the Indians are gonna win. They're good for them, I guess. Although I didn't know anything about their lore and their history of having not won the World Series since the 40s and the history of Cleveland sports, where they have all the struggle. I was not that aware of that stuff. If anything, I maybe was aware of Jordan's shot against Cleveland, and maybe the drive that John Elway had against the Browns. But as far as like Cleveland sports pain as a whole, I wasn't completely aware of any of that stuff. I remember being very excited to watch the Marlins come back and tie the game. One thing I was very aware of was Joe Carter's home run to end the World Series in 1993. Even though, as I mentioned in that video, I didn't see it live. At this point, I was aware of different aspects of baseball history, and I was aware that there had only been 2 home runs ever to end a World Series. Between that one and Bill Mazeroski in the 1960 World Series against the Yankees, and I really, really wanted that to happen, but obviously that didn't happen. But very, very vividly remember Edgar Renteria hitting the line drive off Charles Nagy's glove into center field, and the Marlins win the World Series. Craig Counsell jumps in the air, all excited as he scores the winning run. Absolutely going madness. I remember all of that stuff. I remember Jim Leyland going to the crowd and pumping his fist and yelling and being all hyped, and the Florida Marlins winning it all. And then there was still the backdrop of the Marlins selling their team and kind of having a sell off. Although, I will say this, because I've been playing the 1998 season and Out of the Park Baseball, which I've been posting videos for. If you have any interest in that, you can check them out. But I've been playing the 1998 season, and the first game of the series is against the Florida Marlins. And that team hasn't been. My guess is they did more fire sale as the season went on, but that team wasn't actually as bad as it was presented, at least in the early season. Now maybe some hiring contract guys didn't play. I don't know, but the lineup wasn't very bad. The lineup was actually pretty good. So I'm a little surprised that everybody views it as they completely sold off this fire sale. I know their owner, Wade Huizinga, who I believe ran Blockbuster at the time, did sell following the World Series. So I know there's stuff tied to that, and ultimately maybe that's where all that stuff lies. But I do remember there was this kind of like it was kind of like when the strike happened in 1994 that when anything happened there was always this black cloud over it of well the season's going to come to an end because of the strike. The Marlins World Series kind of had that vibe of yeah, this is great. They won the World Series. First of all, they bought it because they bought all these free agents to get there, which in retrospect is silly. Your goal is to win the World Series. You won the World Series. They did what they were supposed to do. Complaining that somebody bought it, I don't completely buy. Uh, Pun intended, I guess, nowadays, but that's another rant for another time. But there was this like feeling, this like doomed feeling of it where the Marlins weren't going to last as a great franchise, and obviously they haven't been a great franchise, even though they've won 2 World Series. They've won 2 World Series without ever winning division, and they've had like maybe 4 or 5 winning seasons or something like that. Not they aren't a great franchise, but that's probably why I never maintained my fandom. But that started there in that cloud following that World Series, and if that cloud didn't follow the team, I probably do pick the Florida Marlins as my team the following year, and I would to this day be a Florida Marlins fan, which I've said before would be strange to be a Florida Marlins fan who until I actually had never even been to Miami until like 2 years ago, and I never even been to Florida, but I would have been a Marlins fan. But didn't stick, just didn't stick, and then the following year is when I finally got invested into a team and become a Cubs fan. But yeah, that's kind of my little journey post strike to pre to ultimately becoming a Cubs fan. It was kind of a little 3-year run where I would say I'm like a baseball fan nomad. I don't know the right word for it. All that sounds way too dramatic for supporting a baseball team, but that's kind of how I got to where I am now, or at least got to 1998, where the roots were planted for me to become a Cubs fan and become invested in the sport in a season by season way that I wasn't before. Um, and that was kind of that journey. That's basically, honestly, like I would say the last three videos now, is basically my journey pre-Cub fandom, but still a big baseball fandom. And now I have this Cubs fanaticism that I'm now rooted in, where wins and losses like hit you harder and things like that. They're not as much as they used to be, but I'm old. But yeah, I mean that's kind of the journey. You're going from there to here, or there to Cubs fandom, and then I guess the next part of this is I'm basically going to go from my early Cubs fandom to now, where I am doing this. And how did that journey go? So that's probably the next few things that I'll talk about, and there'll probably be a few more blocks where I kind of get there. But if you made it this far, again, if you like, comment, share, whatever it is that you do here, definitely would be appreciated. Subscribe, that's another thing that would be nice. Especially if you watch 45 minutes of me rambling. It's so much appreciated, very appreciated, and it'd be awesome if you showed your support that way. But like I said, thank you for watching this. The next video, I'll probably only touch a little bit on the 1998 season, or if there's other things that I think of, I'll obviously add them, and then we'll kind of go through maybe the 2000 season, because the 2001 Cubs are a very, very meaningful team to myself. And honestly, one of the more underrated Cubs teams to follow, so I kind of want to talk a little bit more about them separately, so maybe I'll go to that point. But all right, well, like I said, thank you for made it this far.